Throughout its history, stretching over millennia, yoga has undergone a process of constant rethinking, reconsideration, and reframing of its goals and its practical purposes. This, of course, progressed slowly over centuries, so the process hasn't necessarily been obvious. Just the same, it has been a steady process of change that has paralleled our development as human beings. Such an evolution of ideas about eternal truths, of course, posed some challenges. Within the Vedic tradition of the western part of India, there was the claim that the truths of the Vedas, and thus of yoga, are timeless and complete. There's nothing to be added to them. This idea of the timelessness of revealed truth was challenged by the teachings of the Buddha and others like him from the eastern part of India, who spoke from their own experience and introduced ideas that were not found in the Vedas. Vedic teachings incorporated these ideas, but the spiritual culture of the Vedas was loath to admit of anything new. And so the Brahmins used literature such as the Puranas, which are legendary tales traced back to primordial sages and the gods, to suggest that these ideas were always there. The philosophy of Vedanta in the Upanishads also went beyond the Vedas into secret truths without suggesting any change to the Vedas. That's where we first find the term yoga applied to spiritual practice in the Katha Upanishad. All of this was in the context of a society that was rapidly changing, and a social structure was changing along with it. The old ways of a simpler, more homogeneous society would not hold. This gave rise to a number of ideas about yoga as time progressed. We had Patanjali summarizing the more ascetic elements of earlier yoga practice into a system designed for the renunciate, who set himself apart from the ways of society. And while this system was called yoga, these ideas actually stood largely outside of the Vedic system and culture. At the same time, the Bhagavad Gita presented a very different idea of yoga, set very much within the culture of the Vedas. After weighing all of the contrasting ideas and approaches to yoga, it settled upon a meaning of yoga that was practical for those of us who are very much living the life of action and of participation in the community. The yogi's understanding of responsibility to one another in the Bhagavad Gita and the very meaning of spiritual sacrifice, all of this was very much steeped in the ways and ethics of the society of the time. Yoga as a personal path had to include support for and even sacrifice for the community, and the principles of ethics, or dharma, were dictated by the traditional social structure that the Brahmins were trying to preserve. Tantra, as a path of personal practice that influenced the development of Hatha Yoga, and Hatha Yoga was indeed something new, arose out of a critique of such spiritual ideas about dharma that are rooted too deeply in social conformity. And the possibilities for practice were meant to extend beyond the very severe practices of the Patanjali yogis. Hatha Yoga became popular not only because it offered a practical, personal path of practice that was non-sectarian, but because it broke down social and sexual barriers that had limited and excluded people. And Hatha Yoga emphasized also practices for physical and emotional wellness that honestly had not been a part of yoga practice before. This process of rethinking, reframing, reconsidering yoga remains just as vital today as it has been at any point in the history of yoga. In that process, it is vital to understand the ideas that came before us on their own terms, as much as we can. These are the ideas of people who, like us, were grappling with the same fundamental problems and challenges, as well as crises and cultural upsets. Their language can seem arcane, distant, and maybe simplistic or irrelevant to our time until we look more closely. Here's where the work comes in. As we seek to understand our own challenges and our concepts for understanding ourselves, we need to understand the ideas of yoga enough to translate them into terms that are meaningful to us here and now, just as was done in the past from century to century. And moreover, we need to recognize when more is needed, when the old ideas are just not enough to address our present situation. For instance, the traditional ethical principles, The yamas and niyamas of Patanjali are just not sufficient to address the challenges of practicing yoga today. Even in the time of Patanjali and afterward, they were the narrow principles of salvation for the renunciate and did not address interpersonal ethics. In contrast to Patanjali, even at that time, there were 10 yamas and 10 niyamas, which addressed interpersonal relationships in ways that Patanjali neglected. The ethical principles of yoga need reconsideration. It's just not working to try to force the square peg of our lives into the very small round hole of Patanjali's yamas and niyamas. This was true centuries ago and is true today. It's also true that with the popularization of Hatha Yoga, the focus has been more and more narrowly on the physical in our times, on fitness, flexibility, and a certain degree of exhibitionism that was accelerated by the advent of photography. I think our recent experience with the pandemic has shown how much that has fallen short, with not just a few people becoming disenchanted and many not returning to yoga practice because they found other options. A narrow sense of practice, especially when joined to a certain amount of magical thinking, has just not been enough. In genuflecting to the ancient wisdom of yoga, we actually have not done it justice. And yoga is at risk of becoming irrelevant as people come up with their own versions of a superficial idea of yoga. I think there is a richness to the language and ideas of yoga that go far deeper than the surface of physical practice. And at the same time, this is not just about meditation. There's an unrecognized depth to the physical and breath practices that go beyond technique. These practices speak to the states of our nervous system as it impacts the health of our hormonal and immune systems, as well as our emotional health. The therapeutic value of yoga lies not in its being a magic pill, but in offering a path of self-inquiry that goes deeply into our own well-being. We don't get that by simply parroting ancient ideas, but by understanding them deeply in relationship to where we are here and now. Those of us who have been given a living through teaching yoga, as well as those of us whose lives have been enriched by doing yoga, owe it to yoga to practice the self-inquiry, atma-vicharya, as well as the inquiry that reconsiders, reframes, rethinks, and reconstitutes yoga while staying true to its meaning, its spirit, and its history of development to keep it alive and vibrant, just as it has been through the centuries. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you in future videos.